Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion about why we are not building more affordable housing. I'm Christian Hetrick, senior writer at the USC Price School of Public Policy. Today's discussion is moderated by Richard Green, an expert on this topic in his own right. Green is director and chair of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate and chair of the Price School's Department of Real Estate Development. Professor Green will introduce our two distinguished panelists today.
Thank you, Christian, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to host this panel today with two great guests, Jennifer Keith and Jenna Hornstock. Between the two of them, we have private, public, and nonprofit sector experience. Jenna is very well known to those of us in the housing community in Los Angeles, having served in senior positions at SCAG and for the mayor of Los Angeles, among other things. And Jennifer is currently the founder of a nonprofit called Ethos, whose purpose is to bring affordable housing to Los Angeles. But before we get into our discussion, I just wanted to make people aware of a resource called SOLACHAN, which stands for the State of Los Angeles County Housing and Neighborhoods, which features pretty much all the information that you could possibly know about housing in Los Angeles County. It is a production of neighborhood data for social change, which is a project of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate. I'm starting to think this is like the beginning of Shakespeare in Love. But let me just point out three things that we found in this year's report. Number one is the amount of time it takes in Los Angeles to build an apartment building after it's permitted. So this is taking into account the permitting process is about twice as long as it takes nationally. Number two is the homeownership rate among the middle class in Los Angeles has fallen dramatically. In fact, so dramatically that I had to ask our team to triple check the data to make sure that we were correct. And third, and perhaps most disturbing, is the share of households with children in Los Angeles is falling dramatically, uh, reflecting the fact that I think parents don't think they can afford to raise kids here in LA. And I don't need to say very much about how problematic that is for our future. So let me just tee it up with those three facts. And then I'm just going to start with a broad question of both Jen and Jenna. Why is it so hard to do affordable housing here in LA? Maybe let's start with Jenna and then we'll go to Jen.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today. That is a pretty loaded and complicated question, Richard. But I mean, I think the reason it's so difficult. I mean, it comes down to kind of economics and market failures, where there's decades of things that have contributed to everything costing too much. I mean, it comes down to it costs too much. So the price of land is very high, and you can attribute some of that to the downzoning that we've seen over the years. And while we're reversing some of that downloading, and particularly in the city of LA with various density bonuses and overlay programs, it's a supply and demand thing. When you've downzoned land, there's less land where you could build, and it drives the price up. There has long been also, the entitlement risk, which again, we're dealing with in different ways, with some CEQA streamlining happening at the state and the density bonus programs, making it easier to build. But over the years, that cost to do entitlement and the risk and then the related lawsuits have driven up costs overall for transactions. We know that the cost of labor, construction labor going up, materials going up. So a lot of it is these economics, but all these factors coming together have really dramatically escalated the cost to build. Jen, if I covered it all.
Yeah. I mean, I would add to that. I think everyone hears the narrative of it costs too much, and then it sort of begs the question of cost too much relative to what? Mm-hmm. And for better or for worse, we live in a capitalist market, and there is an entire ecosystem of finance that drives whether housing gets built or not. And when you look at the cost relative to what, the money that sits behind developers to build more housing, which would ultimately solve the supply and demand imbalance that Jenna's talking about, is looking at housing and development of housing as an investment product. And it weighs the risk of losing their money against the return that they can get out of investing in housing. And right now, the return that you get out of investing in housing for the risk that you take, even setting aside the fact that we have CEQA streamlining, is akin to the return you're getting from buying just a traditional existing building that already has cash flow, that doesn't have the risk of construction overruns or lease up, or even bonds. When interest rates were a little bit higher earlier this year, the way investors look at it is you can buy a bond, which is far less risky on the scale of the risk spectrum from an investment standpoint. And housing really only gets you incremental amounts over that. So if you're even thinking about where do I put my money in my 401k or where do I put my savings, you really should think about it over how much incremental return you're getting over something that's risk-free. And the development of housing, given where the cost is today and the risk associated with it, is not much more return than you would get if you just parked your money in a treasury bill. And that's fundamentally why we're struggling, even though one would say, well, there's so much demand for this housing, that upfront cost and the uncertainty associated with fluctuations around commodities and labor and new regulation demands more of a risk premium over other products, where investors just aren't comfortable putting their money behind real estate or real estate development and housing development.
Okay. So before we move on, I think, given that I think we have many people in our audience who don't think about real estate development all that often, I'm going to ask each of you one clarifying question. So Jenna, you talked about entitlement risk, and Jennifer got into that a little bit too, but tell us what that means. What is entitlement risk?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, there is land use that dictates what you can build on the land. Generally, land use is dictated by a city, although ultimately the state can supersede cities' land use rights. And we've actually seen that happening in some ways, or in a lot of ways in California. But this piece of property, if you're looking at it, there is a zone and a whole host of things that come with that zoning that tell you what you can build, how high, how dense, like how many units per acre. It tells you how much parking you need to build, if there's open space, if there's setbacks, which are spaces right between you and your neighbors. And so when folks look at a piece of land and want to build it, in LA City for many decades, we had a practice of not allowing a lot to be built. And actually, we actively downzoned the city in a number of ways during what we'd call the slow growth movement, which was really kind of the late 70s through the 80s and carried on. So we made it so that you could build less. So what we see a lot of is when a developer is buying a piece of land, they're thinking, I'm going to get a new entitlement. I'm going to go to the city and try to get permission to build more. And there's a process for that, and it's risky. And probably a lot of our audience have heard of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, but generally a lot of these actions to change the entitlement of the land would trigger a CEQA process. And a lot of folks who didn't want to see more housing or more dense housing or affordable housing would use CEQA, where they would use a lawsuit, right, and challenge that. So it creates a lot of time and real money that you have to spend to do it on attorneys and risk. So hopefully that answers the question.
That's a great answer, but I want to, and this is actually what I was going to ask Jennifer anyway. So I want to drill down a little bit. What is CEQA and why has it been a problem?
Well, CEQA stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. And it's a process that the state put in place to ensure that new development took into account environmental impacts. And that could be everything from shade and shadow studies around how your project will impact the neighbors, to traffic impacts, to environmental, impacts on wildlife and nature, et cetera. And the genesis of it, I think, is well thought out. But what has been happening for quite some time is, as Jenna mentioned, sort of the weaponization of CEQA as a means to stopping new development. And The CEQA process allows for the public to get involved in the approval of new projects. And uh, the litigation that Jenna spoke to is people can sue and challenge the findings of CEQA studies. So when you are a developer and you're looking to build something new, you hire consultants who study the impacts of your project, and those can be challenged by third parties under a lawsuit. And those lawsuits are often difficult to disprove because how do you project where traffic impacts are going to be, 4 years from now, and the cumulative impacts of your project and other projects. And so you end up in these long litigation processes. And there's really sort of a cottage industry that evolved of people who would hire attorneys to litigate against impacts and whether they were valid or not. And so you could stop an entire development project just by continuing to sue and litigate. And developers don't have infinite capacity on time or money. And when Jenna speaks to this increases risk, when you are a developer putting together a project, more often than not, you're bringing in outside money. So that means you're convincing someone to write a check to support your project. And you give them parameters that say, I'm spending this exact amount of money within, certain margins. But if you have a lawsuit and suddenly your budget blows up because now you have extra time where you have to pay to carry the land, and oh, you might now deliver the project into a difficult market, all of that adds risk, and investors don't like uncertainty about how long it's going to take to get their money back and how much money they will make on that money. So CEQA just became another lever for people to stop development entirely.
And I think let's talk a little bit about when you say cost to carry the land. I think a lot of people don't understand because they have no reason to, right? They're busy with their lives doing other things. Why time actually makes stuff more expensive. So can you just talk a little bit more about that? What did that phrase that you just used about carrying the land?
Sure. I'll try and come up with an example people can relate to. Say you buy an apartment building and your intent is to lease it out and collect income on that apartment building, but you never lease it out. You're just holding the property without people in it. You've already paid to buy it, and maybe you got a loan to purchase it. So now you're paying interest on that loan. You're paying insurance, you're paying property taxes, but you're not getting any revenue. um, Holding a piece of land for development is very similar. You've purchased the land, maybe you took out a loan to purchase the land, and you're paying interest on something that's not generating any revenue. And if you thought it would take 1 year to get to a point where you have your permits and you can build it over the course of another 2 years, by year three, you're leasing up and hoping to get some money to offset the cost of carrying the land. So now you have rents coming in, you can pay your loan, you can pay your property taxes, and slowly start building enough equity to pay off your cost of the land. If you have another 2 years or 3 years because you're fighting lawsuits, that expands your budget because now you're carrying that cost of holding the land without income for a longer duration. And again, any uncertainty as far as, oh, well, we think, the market's going to hold for another 3, 4 years, but now it's another 4, 5, 6 years, and maybe we'll be in an economic downturn or other people will build around you, and suddenly you are less certain the further you push into the future if your project will be successful or not. All of those factor into costs from the standpoint of the person who's investing in these projects.
So we have a number of questions from Brian. I think it's Janik. If I'm mispronouncing your name, I apologize. Janik Kianik. And I'm going to try to collapse them into a couple of questions because other people want to ask questions too. But one, I hope I'm understanding this question properly, is he's getting at the idea that it doesn't make sense to develop affordable housing. What you should do is develop market rate housing and basically free up the existing stock, which as he says thousands. Of course, we have about 3.5 million housing units in existence in Los Angeles County. And it's sort of a very expensive way to produce housing that people can afford, let's put it that way, by building new stuff. And maybe what you should be doing is using money to acquire old stuff, make it habitable. Any reactions to that and I hope I'm characterizing the flavor of the question correctly, but any reactions to that? Either one of you.
Thank you, Brian, for the question. It sets up really well because that's what I do through the company Ethos that I co-founded. We acquire older vintage buildings and convert them to affordable housing. And in a perfect world, you're building and quote unquote preserving, as the conversion of older vintage to affordable is typically called. I fully agree. I think building affordable housing in a light tech structure takes a lot longer, is more expensive, and that's a whole nother conversation. But we need both. We need to be building and typically market rate building, building market rate housing is there's more financing for that. And then preserving existing is becoming an increasingly important part of maintaining what we already have as affordable. There's a McKinsey study that says unregulated, just naturally occurring affordable housing is the largest source of affordable housing we have in this country. So what we need to do is make sure we don't lose that, because building will never catch up with this original pool of housing that's already affordable. All I can say is I fully validate what you're saying, Brian, and I think it's important that we do both.
Yeah, I caught up. I think it also is an important both and. Um, Absolutely, there's opportunity. And to Jen's point, and what we're seeing right now with how expensive it is to build market rate or affordable, you're seeing a lot of shift, particularly in the private markets on acquisition. And and because of different financing structures out there, what's nice is there's opportunity to acquire and make units permanently affordable, right? They might be what Jen said, which is naturally occurring, meaning it's been there a long time, people are living there a long time, the rents are lower, or because of rent control, the rents are lower. But by bringing in a focused effort and making those permanently affordable through covenants, I think that's great. But we still do need more housing. I mean, Richard started with the point of we think maybe we're losing population or losing families. I mean, the fact is we do need more housing stock and more housing stock to house and plan for a growing population and the needs of our population. And I also think we need more housing stock along our commercial corridors. You know, I talked about the downzoning of the city that primarily happened with Prop U in 1986. Is that right, Richard? 86 was Prop U.
I thought it
Um,
was a little earlier than that, but you may be right, Jenna.
but Prop U, essentially, it was a proposition that downzoned the whole city. It reduced how much
Mhm.
floor area ratio, and I don't want to get technical, but it reduced how much you could build along most of our commercial corridors. And if you think about a thriving city with a good quality of life, you want your apartments on your commercial corridors where you're more likely to be close to things you can walk to, markets, recreational things, jobs, and also because we're building out our transit system. And Richard didn't mention, but I worked at LA Metro and ran a real estate development for 8 years. So I think about transit a lot. And a healthy city to grow, we want to grow where there's activity and where there's access to transit. So we also create healthier communities. So I think figuring out new construction and new housing is also an important part of the equation. It's a both and.
So there's a comment from Aishi about low-income housing tax credit program and how inefficient it is. And this is a program, for those who are not familiar with it, that has what are called 9% credits and 4% credits. And I'm not going to get into the rules too much, but a way to look at it is about between 40 and 90% of construction cost for housing that has affordability covenants on it is paid for through tax credits that are syndicated by the federal government. I'm going to just tell a secret before I ask you two what you think of it and how you might change it. Is when I worked at HUD in the Obama administration, we would talk with Treasury about LIHTC and how would the money be better spent. And the economists all thought we should just cancel the program and send all the money to Section 8 vouchers because we could show that about 90% of Section 8 money actually goes to the people it's designed to help, whereas somewhere between 40 and 50% of the LIHTC money at that time was actually helping,
Mm.
lower income people with their housing.
Yeah.
And so with that, okay, I'm again loading the question, Jenna. I'm sorry, but
Right.
So let's LIHTC is not go, but LIHTC is very politically
Yeah.
popular. It's not going to go away. I mean, even in a Republican administration,
They just
the
increased it.
it's increased.
Yeah.
So how can we make it better, or can we make
Well,
it better?
I want to back up for a second and
Okay,
put it into context. I do think LIHTC started in 1986. I think
that
that's
is
right. It's one
correct.
of the
No,
tax
it was
reform
part of the
acts.
Tax Reform Act of
So,
1986. That's correct.
so I want to put this in a macro context of what I talked about at the beginning, which is costs. Back then, you could build an 100% affordable project pretty much with just LIHTC and private funding. Like you got your tax credits and you got a loan and you're off and running. What has made it more efficient over the years is particularly in high cost places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, most cities, the cost to build that same unit, even in relative terms to the market, has dramatically skyrocketed, right? And so you need other funding sources. So it takes forever. And we think we've established time is money for many, many reasons in all kinds of markets, but particularly in the housing market, because you can't build a unit with just the tax credit and a loan. You're going after, and Jen knows this very firsthand because I've suffered through this with her, you're going after 7 layers of other public subsidy. And there was a study recently that said like each layer adds 20,000 per unit of cost. So I just want to back up into high level.
Yeah.
See, part of what's driving the challenge with tax credits is the cost of everything has gotten so high. So the program itself isn't a one-stop solution. I do think it's important, since we're talking kind of philosophically policy level about tax credits. Listen, I think Section 8 vouchers are amazing, and I'm terrified for what is happening right now at the federal level. But Jen and I both went to Vienna to study their social housing model, and something that really stuck with me that I took away, and they have a much more in-depth kind of involvement in the market, in the housing market, but they look at the importance philosophically of giving an object versus a subject subsidy. A Section 8 voucher is a subject subsidy. You will have to do it forever. You have to pay the rent, that rent differential forever. And let's be clear, while it is directly helping the person, the money is going into the landlord's pocket. And listen, I'm a landlord. I'm not saying all landlords are bad, but you have to continually pay and rents go up. And so I don't want to say it's never ending, but it's infinite, the Section 8 voucher. In theory, an object subsidy, like a tax credit, you create a permanently affordable unit. So you do a one-time upfront injection into a building, and now that unit is always affordable, and you don't have to continue. I mean, there's recapitalization, but I just want to center us philosophically about the program before we say blow everything up. The other
So what
thing
we did, so Jenna, just so you know, what we did is we looked at the present value of basically an infinite Section 8 subsidy and compared it to the LIHTC upfront cost.
Yeah.
And the subsidy, the Section 8 still won.
Oh, well, then I'm fascinated by that. Actually, that's really helpful me. I've been doing a lot of work in my consulting life around actually creating a guarantee tool that would help turn Section 8 vouchers into financial instruments. So I'm all about Section 8 as a solution right now. I'm totally with you. And I'm now dying to see this analysis because it'll make me feel better. But
okay, I will send you spreadsheets.
Yeah, yes, please. I love a spreadsheet. So I think the other thing to think about with tax credits and where maybe there's some fixes is, if anybody has read the book Abundance, there's a wonderful chapter on
there's one of our audience members brought it up. So this is
okay.
Great. Go.
So the challenge with tax credits is it became a place to load all of our hopes and dreams of the most utopian, perfect kind of housing. It's going to be the most sustainable, and it's going to be in a good neighborhood, and it's going to be near transit, and it's going to have all these bells and whistles and a community room and a dog park, or not dog park, but sadly, partially because we don't invest enough in our surrounds. We don't have enough parks. And so your tax credit project has to have this open space. So we pile onto these projects a lot of requirements that make them cost more. So again, I think there's a lot of things that have made the tax credit program more difficult and costly and not as effective, but they could be fixed. They can be fixed, I think, is my point. The other thing I'll say is this: before the last 5 to 7 years, when the state has gone full on, we're stepping into land use and we're allowing streamlining and we're giving density bonuses, and then the cities are picking up. Tax credits was almost the only way you were getting 100% affordable projects. I just want to remind us of that. It's only recently that private market developers are going, hey, I'm going to do affordability. I'm going to do 100% affordable because of all this streamlining and entitlement and changes to CEQA. So it used to be the only thing we had to get 100% affordable. Now there are other options. So I would go back to it's worth having a look at it again, but I'm just trying to place it in context before we demonize, the program so much.
Well, I just wanted to raise the point, but let's talk a little bit about what do we even mean by affordable. So Jennifer, Keith, JK instead of JH. When we say affordable, what are we talking about here?
Yeah,
it's a great question because we've learned in all the very different markets we invest in across California, everybody has a different definition of affordable. It's like what's affordable to them, right? I think common way of designating what's affordable is if someone's paying 30% or less of their income in housing expense. You would know the statistic better than I, but it's something like 50% of the California population is paying 40% or more of their income in housing expense. In many cases, 50% or more. The expression you're severely rent burdened would be, I believe that's over 40% of income.
Severely is 50.
Severely 50.
Yeah. But
it's
not that important.
But that's how I think of affordability is that you're not spending, half your earnings just to house yourself. And, that depends on that's relative to how much one is earning. And that's how I think of affordability. That's how we measure affordability. And that's sort of how the government sets their affordability targets on a relative basis in a jurisdiction based on what the area median income is for a county by geography.
Okay, but let's talk about it in another dimension. Is affordable to whom?
Right.
So I think a really important policy question is, do you focus all your efforts on those who have very low incomes or extremely low incomes? Or do you care as much about what some people call workforce housing, which we'll call people between 80 and 120% of area median income? And I'm sorry I'm using these terms, but it is how these things are defined. So where should our priorities be, and why?
Well, I can jump in real quick just on the back of the LIHTC conversation. To lift up what doesn't, I think, get highlighted enough, which is inclusionary zoning and the ability to produce affordable housing units, whether it's at the deeply affordable or more in the moderate income space, as part of a predominantly market rate project. So I personally, my own take is, to use the public subsidy that we have for the most deeply affordable, because there is no market program that can address 30 and 50% of AMI households, but then use public-private partnership or conversion of existing buildings to affordable to address workforce housing, population affordability. I mean, I think we should focus on everybody and make sure that everybody can afford or isn't severely rent burdened, because that workforce is incredibly important just for the sustenance of our society and democracy and on and on and on. So I think there is no one class that I think should be necessarily prioritized over the other. But as far as the public dollars that are available, there is no market mechanism to produce at the deeply, deeply affordable level. So I think we should look at more public-private solutions for the workforce tier of AMIs, and then, prioritize LIHTC for the more deeply affordable. Although there are arguments about ensuring that we don't concentrate poverty either. So there's some conflicting public policy components there. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think, Jenna.
Well, I think there's actually a very, data policy driven answer, which is every 7 years, the state requires cities and counties to they have SCAG develop what's called the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And it's like PhD economists and demographers, they literally tell you as a city and county how many units you need at what income levels? So the answer of who to prioritize, like literally there's a number, right? Like LA City's RENA is 455,000 by 2029, that many units. And within the very low and low income, those lower levels, it's like 186,000 units, and it's based on data. So we actually know what is the need across different income brackets based on the RENA, which gets adopted, and approved by the state. I have to say, and then as Jen gets into it, what it starts getting into in terms of implementation is how can you finance and produce those units? Because the reality is it costs to build a building. There's investors, there's interest to pay on a loan. It costs to operate a building, right? I mean, once you have it operating, if the rents aren't covering what your operating costs are, that's a problem. And so the challenge is how do you meet the needs of those various, particularly very low income units, or even some of the low and operate. So I'm talking from a very like pragmatic, technical standpoint. I think the last thing I want to say, this is personal to me, but a lot of people who know me know this, I can't stand the term workforce housing because it suggests that people in the lowest incomes don't work, and they do. People at 50% AMI who are generally not considered workforce, they're working. They are working at Target. They're taking care of your grandmother and has a home health aide. There are security guards. But and I don't blame anybody. It is the lexicon. But I just like to root us in where these terms come from, which is I don't want certain people living near me or in my neighborhood, or it comes from back in the 80s, like the welfare myth, the welfare queen myth, and using the term workforce, it others people just based on their income because it does refer to incomes. And the reality is, except maybe for some of the lowest of low who maybe have mental health, substance abuse, other disorders, pretty much everybody in affordable housing is working. They have some kind of a job. So I just like to put it there.
I've never heard that take before, but I think it's a really good one, and I will not use that term again.
Oh, when I was on City Planning Commission, I actually directed the department to come up with a whole policy paper on the term workforce and when it will be used, because that was part of our racial equity commitment. And I put it on my soapbox just because I like to get us to think about what we're saying
Well,
and what it means.
what I will say is this, and this is why I do think subsidies really are necessary, is when you look at the share of people who are paying more than 30 or 50% of their incomes on housing, they are overwhelmingly working people. I used the census to run the numbers. I don't remember what the exact number is, but it is a whole lot. So I want to come back though to a couple of, because we have a lot of, I want to try to get to some of the questions and comments that we've been getting. Let's just talk about a really basic thing. I want to come back to cost for just a second. And there is, and I want to give credit to the people who asked the question. It's about the land versus construction cost or other costs. In your experience, what has mattered more here in LA anyway, in terms of the cost of stuff going up? And whoever asked, it's a really good question. Whoever asked it, and I'm just not finding your name right now. I'm sorry. But your thoughts on land versus construction cost?
Well, I'll start by 100 years ago when I did the MRED at USC. We used about a third of the cost for the land and the remainder for hard costs and soft costs, and hard costs being the actual sticks and bricks that build the building, and soft costs for architectural engineering, for those who aren't familiar with the nomenclature and financing expense, the interest that you're paying on your construction loan. Now, with where costs have gone, it's now 20 years later since I graduated from the MRED. Land is actually a fairly small component of the total cost basis. And that's frustrating because the city of LA and the state of California has done a really great job of doing an inventory of government-owned property that could be put to market for development of housing. But because free land is just such a small component of the total cost to build, it doesn't particularly move the needle on the threshold of, oh, I can now build because the land is free. And so that's been another reason why things aren't moving, because in many cases, in particular in LA, you'd need the landowner to pay you to make it pencil. So that's when we say that the land has negative land value. Like you can't even free land wouldn't work. So unfortunately, land is it's just a small component, and the the areas in the construction costs where costs have really risen is on the actual hard costs. Labor costs have gone up, and again, that's an area also where you have a lot of unpredictability with tariffs and where things are in the supply chain. So I wish I had a more positive answer.
Yeah.
Jenna?
I was looking at some of the questions just to try to get a sense of how we're doing with all you out there we appreciate you listening to us yammer on. I want to go back on Section 8, if that's okay, Richard, a little bit
Yep.
from the
Yep.
questions. I
Yep.
saw a whole range, and I'm trying to listen and read, so forgive me if I don't get it right. But I've been really interested and fascinated with Section 8 and been doing some work with philanthropy around it. And some people are saying, is there not enough? So historically, a lot of landlords wouldn't take it. And there have been even like slumlord problems and people, because people would get a Section 8 voucher and you have a certain amount of time to find a unit. And if you don't, even if you get an extension, I learned this even in the last year from the housing authority, like 50% of Section 8 vouchers come back. And I want you to understand there's a 30,000 person wait list wanting vouchers that we don't have. And you get one and giving it back, like that's a really big deal. But what I think is interesting, and I want to lift this up as an interesting change in the market, and we haven't started talking solutions, and I'd really love to in our last 22
we're going to do
minutes.
that next. Yeah.
Because of all these density bonuses going on, right? The state, and someone asked about CEQA and what can the state do? SB 35 is some pretty amazing CEQA streamlining. That was one of the first ones, but there's more and more. The state has gotten really emboldened in saying, again, CEQA might have had good intentions. Really read the abundance chapter on CEQA. It's so good. Because the state is saying if you either have some amount, 20%, some amount, or all affordable, we're just going to make it easier to build. You're seeing more and more people enter the affordable housing space, whether it's 100% affordable or some percent. And what a lot of developers are doing is they're going, hey, I have this affordable covenanted unit, and I'll take an extreme version, an extremely low income unit serving someone at 30% AMI. According to a state, there's different rent schedules. With a state rent schedule, that pays $852 a month for a one bedroom, thereabouts. Anyone who has a Section 8 voucher is extremely low income. There's nobody with a voucher that is higher income. We're talking, you could meet that income level requirement with a voucher holder, but that voucher, depending on your zip code, could pay, I'm going to go low, $2,100 a month. So all of a sudden have all these private market developers that are doing inclusionary units that are like, hey, looks better for my pro forma if I get a voucher holder. And what's interesting about that, this is like a policy intervention, is all of a sudden people want voucher holders, whereas there's been this huge amount of discrimination historically. So I find that really maybe a positive outcome, right, in the market. Gives more opportunity to people to live in better neighborhoods, better buildings, better cared for buildings, mixed income environments. But what's not happening is that extra income is not helping projects pencil financially. So the same problems that Jen talked about, I got to get an investor to want to invest in this building. They can't count on that.
Still not there.
Because the voucher holder has choice. If you get a voucher, hopefully you're choosing a unit, if someone will take you, but there's no guarantee for that owner. And so one of the things we've looked at from a financing perspective through philanthropy, and I hope one day in the public sector, is guaranteeing that debt. If there's some extra debt you can get because you're getting that voucher level rent, then how can we help you turn that debt into a financial instrument? How can we help you get a loan based on that debt so we can get your project going? So I'm kind of oversimplifying this guarantee concept, but it's something we're launching through philanthropy.
So there are a couple of comments I want to make. So first of all, beyond the issue of willingness to take it, we have this program that sort of goes in fits and starts, which is what's called small area FMRs, small area fair market rents. And the problem in Los Angeles County has been that the Section 8 rent is determined by, I think it's the 80th percentile or 80% of the median or something. No, it's the 40th percentile rent in all of Los Angeles County. Okay, what does that mean? It means that in Palmdale and Lancaster, your Section 8 rent is actually higher than market rents. Whereas on the west side of LA, there's nothing that it has nothing to do with this. I mean, I don't doubt, Jenna, that there's discrimination, but in Brentwood, Section 8 is not close to market rent. And so The idea of small area is that you define rental markets based on much smaller units of geography. So Palmdale has a different
But
rent from Brentwood,
yeah,
has a different rent from, you get the idea. Uh, I think without that kind of change, and it's not, the Obama administration wanted to do it, Trump administration reversed it, Biden administration started implementing it, Trump administration again not happy with it.
yeah.
But without that fundamental change in our largest cities, it's a real problem in terms of Section 8.
Well, but let me flip that from a problem into a solution. For existing units, sure, I get what you're saying. Like an existing, I own a building and I don't want to take that Section 8 voucher holder. I don't have to because I don't have a covenant on my building and they don't pay high enough. But for new construction, which is what we're talking about today, there is an opportunity because of these inclusionary zoning or density bonus units. Because people are now looking to build a new building with low income units and not necessarily public subsidy, they just want to build it. That rent, whether you think it's the right market rent or not, is higher than the covenanted rent. And so there is, I'm trying to look to like the positive. There is
Yeah, yeah.
opportunity here to mesh together some of these public policy solutions to help drive construction. That's kind of how I try to be optimistic.
So with that, let's talk about some of the stuff that's gone on in both Los Angeles and in the state of California over the last, I'm going to say about 10 years, and talk about how much these things matter. So let's start with in the city of LA, there's a program called the Transit Oriented Communities Program that basically says that if you are within a certain distance of a major transit station and you reserve a certain share of your units for low income people, you need if you have more deeply affordable stuff, you need to set aside fewer units than if you have less deeply affordable stuff. You get a density bonus, and basically the trade-off is because you can build more market rate units, they basically cross subsidize those affordable units that you have to keep affordable for 55 years. Okay, that program has been with us now for 7 or 8 years, maybe even a little longer than that. Is it moving the needle? Do you see an impact from that? And I'm going to talk to you both about a series of programs, but let's just start with that one.
I'll start by saying, having worked on a TOC project, I have to give kudos to the city and to the state for really moving the needle on programs that encourage mixed income projects, that streamline CEQA, that take the discretionary component out of getting to your project approvals. It has made a difference. I think the numbers show the amount of units that have been entitled and approved has been tremendous over the last several years. Now, getting them built is sort of the next hurdle. But from a policy standpoint, I would argue that the policy has been very successful, even in pulling out some of the cost. Jenna and I worked on a project that was TOC Tier 4, which meant it was on the most significant transit location that you could have in the city of LA, which meant we actually did not have to build any parking because it isn't necessary. We were on two major metro stations, and parking is one of the biggest cost elements of housing production. And we probably have a whole nother webinar around where parking makes sense and where no parking makes sense in the city of LA. But I do think from a policy standpoint, TOC has been fantastic in both streamlining, finding ways to cross subsidize and pull out cost from the development process. We're still struggling overall on the cost element that we've already talked about, but the path to getting to a permit has been truncated significantly. So I'll say I think these policies have been great.
Jenna, you have anything to add? Okay, but so there are a number of questions about can we use prefab techniques, housing manufactured off-site techniques? How much of that could help us with some of these cost issues that we've been talking about?
Yeah. I mean, prefab comes up a lot. And what I can say is what I've heard from a lot of developers, which is negligible. It doesn't necessarily reduce costs. It can, but that it just isn't quite moving the needle. And I feel like there's been some studies, but some of it has to do with just like there has to be a scale of the prefab, that particular model happening in order for it to really reduce cost. But when you've got everybody coming up with all these different prefab models, you're not getting to the economies of scale. What I've heard from developers anecdotally, and I saw like at the city, there was an innovation challenge under the HHH program, and those units were only negligibly less expensive. So I think they can be great, but I haven't heard, I don't know, Jen, if you've heard differently, that prefab has really moved the needle on cost.
I I struggle with this because I know someone who's in the prefab space and they've traveled extensively to Asia and cite Singapore and China as being 20 plus years ahead of us in the prefab and modular space. And when I ask him, the vast majority of their new construction in residential is prefab and or modular. And it was mandated that 80% of new residential construction materials be either prefab or manufactured off-site. And that policy drove the market to innovate and get to a place where the capital markets backed it as well. I think the challenge here, the anecdotes are it's negligible on saving time and cost because a lot of the prefab has to be trucked across, multiple jurisdictions and stored somewhere, and that's very expensive. And insurance for construction doesn't really like modular. And oh my gosh, what if the manufacturer goes out of business? How do we deal with that? I think those are all still growing pains. But another issue we just have again is going back to the ecosystem of finance behind housing production. In the last 20 years, the money behind housing has become much more institutional, and it wants housing to be a widget, which it is not, unfortunately. And modular, no one wants to be the first. Everyone's like, oh, okay, yeah, we really want to be in housing and this modular sounds really good. But real estate is very backwards looking and it really wants to treat it like it's a commodity, even though it's not. It's very tied to location and, the exact cross streets can make a difference and the topography and, who's adjacent to you and the environmental conditions of the site. So it's not a widget, but the market, the capital markets want it to be a widget. And I think the introduction of modular, unless there's a mandate to do it, I think my experience is anybody we talk to on the financing side who wants to build or back someone who's building, and to your point, Jenna, about scale, they want to do scale and they want something that's been tried and true because no one wants to go to their investment committee and say, oh gosh, this project failed because we tried modular and it didn't quite work. And that's much harder to justify. I think if we had policy mandates, which I'm not necessarily recommending, but other countries have mandates that modular be used and they figured it out. And now it's the predominant way of building at far lower cost. And the financial markets accommodated that because that was the only way to go.
So I was going to go, well, let me go to one other, we'll go to two other, but there's just such a great, now I'm going to go to this question and then I'm going to come back. Is Coriol, I just love this question. The state has passed a series of policies in the last 5 to 8 years to ease the development process, but private housing authorizations remain flat, down since 2017. Is that an interest rate issue? What more can the state do from a process streamlining standpoint to incentivize additional development at scale? And it is a frustration when I look at data. I mean, I do think we're doing really good things. I was going to ask about ADUs, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But we are not actually seeing the number of units produced in the state of California increase, nor, and now, COVID got in the way. There's no doubt about that. But what is going on that we can't seem to budge this number? Or is it that it just takes time for this stuff? So I'll give it let me be concrete. Okay. I want to come back to ADUs. Okay, so basically we've gone from an environment where it was difficult to build them to where from a permitting standpoint, it's easy to do them. Okay, we have basically, again, I'm going to refer to Solachan, quadruple the number of ADUs we build in a year in LA County that receive certificates of occupancy. So that's great, right? But instead of adding to total production, it seems to just be coming out of cannibalizing other stuff that used to happen. So again, do we just need to be patient for these policies to start to matter? Or is there other stuff we need to think about?
I'm not sure I understand what's the problem with ADUs that we're still not solving the house. I mean, one
So,
thing I actually was told yesterday at an ADU showcase full of modular ADUs, was by someone in philanthropy that people are building them but not renting them out.
ah,
Which, by the way, I have an ADU and it is rented to a lower income person. It is not covenanted, but one of my neighbors who uh, I rented to in the neighborhood. But that was one thing I thought was interesting to learn anecdotally from someone in philanthropy is people are building them and not renting them out. They're like for family that comes to visit, or it's their office, or to get
yeah.
away from their spouse. I don't know, but
Yeah, but I
yeah,
guess what I'm getting at is we have seen the needle is this policy change has moved the
yeah,
needle on ADUs. There's no question
yeah,
about it.
yeah,
We're building a lot more of them. But when we look at the total additions to the housing stock,
oh,
we're not seeing a whole lot of change over the last, I'm going to say,
yeah,
8 or 9 years. And last time I'll mention it, Caroline Balla will be happy. Look at Solichen. You can see all
yeah.
of these data. Uh,
Right. Well,
so,
then I think
yeah, go ahead.
I would say I think part of the challenge is a lot of folks, and I think you hinted at this, they're entitling projects, but not able to finance them and get them built. So there are, I don't know, upwards of 40,000 units we think entitled in the city of LA that, at least if you look at public data on, is it moving through the system, the process, like from entitlement, which is permission to build, to permitting, which is you've done your construction plans, then to start of construction, they're stuck somewhere. And I think this goes back to the conversation we've had just about the capital markets and the cost to build. Like you
Yeah.
might have entitled, you might have a piece of land, you bought it and you entitled it, but you're like, oh, still can't make this pencil. Nobody's going to finance this because it's not working. So that I think that might be some of it.
Yeah, and I would add, a lot of the money in the ecosystem for just housing and real estate investment comes from insurance companies, pension funds, endowments. They're not big risk takers and they're not demanding outsized profits. I mean, these are people who are looking for actuarial predictable returns, but what they can't risk is losing money.
Mhm.
Um, Real estate development, people are looking to earn 7% on their money. So just to level set, this is not somebody who's like, I'm going to take $10 million and I want to triple it. Um, it's just trying to get a stable single digit return on that investment. But when you think about alternatives that can earn 7%, there are others that are less risky. And I would add to the risk factor that even once you get a project entitled and you find the money to build it, there's a lot of policy that's happening in the housing environment that is unpredictable, and investors are scared because going back to, okay, well, the investor says, I'm going to give you a finite amount of money to build this, and I'm expecting to earn this return, X return. However, if there's an eviction moratorium or suddenly there's a cap on where rents can go, these then really change the expectations around the revenue side of the equation. And many investors have been burned by that because they had an expectation around what their return would be. And then because of some policy mandate, and I'm not putting a good or bad qualifier on the policy, but I'm just saying they expected to get X, they got something less than X because of policy, and now they're saying, well, how do we know 2 years from now there won't be some new mandate that says landlords have to haircut their rents by 10%? You just don't know. And so that's another fear risk element that's keeping people out of putting their money behind real estate and putting it into the stock market or aircraft leasing or who knows what other more safe appearing investments.
And a comment that's come up a couple of times is, asking about what about Prop ULA? Now that's just the city of Los Angeles, but
Hmm.
it is possible to build something, sell it at a loss, and still have to pay taxes on it in the city of Los Angeles, and
Hmm.
presumably that makes it a less attractive place to build. So let's try to finish with something upbeat. We have about 4 minutes left, and since you are both women of vision, in your ideal world, look 20 years from now, what is, with respect to housing, what is, and I'll say Southern California, let's not just limit it to the city of LA. What is how does it look different from the way it looks right now?
Well, I want to maybe I want to lift up a few things that I think are positive lights right now and
Okay.
trying to move the needle, and that'll drive how it looks. Like one is in my new world of being a consultant, I'm working with a lot of private developers, primarily for profit, although with partnerships that are figuring out how to, what I talked about earlier, marry some of the things that are out there, the tools, to come up with a new way to deliver. And for example, because of the density bonus, because of the streamlining and 100% affordable projects being interesting, you could use 4% tax credits and bonds. This is not the 9% LIHTC, but they're finding that they can deliver projects like we're looking to finance some larger deals through 4% tax credits and bonds. So one silver lining is more of our commercial corridors are built up with apartments that are affordable, and they were financed through these mechanisms, which do not trigger all the things that we're talking about per se that make it more expensive per unit. So I see in the future our commercial corridors having more of these apartment buildings that are taking the tools and figuring out creative ways to make them work. Number two,
And about how much bulk do these apartment buildings have, Jenna? Are they four
the ones
stories,
I'm talking about, 5 to 6 stories.
5 to 6 stories? Okay,
Yeah.
so Parisian.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The other thing that I don't want to go too deep into it, but I think a way that I would love to see us grow that marries multi-benefit outcome is we need more sustainable infrastructure in our cities, meaning we need district level planning for electric, for water, gray water systems, recycled water. Because we have these housing elements, which we haven't talked about, but the RENA goes into a housing element and cities and counties show how they're going to grow. They literally say, here's how we're going to meet all these numbers. This, like, literally they'll give you addresses. You can build here, or they say we're going to upzone here. So we actually have a blueprint of where we want to grow. And we could choose to grow sustainably by using our public dollars. We can reduce the cost to build if we reduce the cost of infrastructure, right? So one of the things that makes land expensive is if the electrical grid does not have capacity to support your project, you got to upgrade the whole thing. That could be $1 million. So I want to see a future where we're planning for sustainable infrastructure at a district level, where we're planting the seeds so that we have better sustainable infrastructure and we reduce the cost to build housing. And we have that housing built sustainably without each individual project carrying that burden and cost. But that's where we invest. So that's another vision I have for the future that I hope for.
And Jennifer Keith, your vision.
20 years from now, I hope for a lot more densification on transit nodes. I hate the 5/2 stucco box on top of podium parking. I really, and that's, because of financing requirements and costs and everything, but I do hope we have some construction tech solutions that allow multiple types of construction, towers, townhomes. We talked in our prep call about New York City and the variety of homes and residential types you see there. It's not just all towers. You have every type of residential typology, and I hope for more of that for LA in particular. One thing I'm hoping for is open sourcing information more. I can't tell you how many times I have to call up other developers and say, hey, what are you seeing in costs right now? Where are you getting your insurance? If there were a better repository of all this information, there's so much money spent on consultants. No disrespect for consultants, but it's just all adds cost and time around like what's happening right now. I don't understand this new policy. If we could open source just information more broadly, it would help so much. I think that's like a very easy tech solution, hopefully in the near future. And then finally, from a policy standpoint, to help ease that risk around future regulation, if we could have sort of a grandfathering, once you're in, you've opted in to a set of regulations. There's similar things in the LIHTC space because those projects can't afford future regulation that might reduce rents significantly because they run at such thin margins. They can't reduce. I'm like, why can't we have that for existing buildings? That would take out a tremendous amount of fear from the money sources around, well, we can't predict what will happen 20 years from now. So I'm hopeful that there's some way to take that risk out of the equation. But I'm still, despite everything, optimistic. We can figure this out.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Jennifer Keith, Jenna Hornstock, for a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And I wish we could keep going, but we're at the top of the hour. My name is Richard Green. This has been Price Presents. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.